chapter 9, we get to thinking about basically running a business and some of those aspects of it. So you're thinking more about, like in this first section, you're thinking about if you ran like a lumber yard, for instance, okay, and you had a warehouse. Now it doesn't have to be a lumber yard; it can be anything. But
an ice cream business.
An ice cream business. Okay, yeah, we could do the ice cream business. So at the parlor, you got to have like a little storage closet or something, right? So stocking that storage closet and keeping it up to having the necessary bowls or whatever you're gonna have, right? Yeah, all of your different kind of cones, all of your. I'm assuming you wear gloves, okay? But ice cream scoops, you know, to scoop it out, all that kind of stuff. And we're gonna talk about how you would prepare and how would you order for those kind of things. So we're now you're gonna change your mind frame that you're now the boss, basically. You're the manager of this store, okay? So the first thing that we talk about is the categories that you would break this company down into. Okay, so the first category are raw materials. What's that mean to you? Obviously you can read this, but what does raw materials mean to you in general?
Like natural.
Materials to build products.
Yeah.
The materials that you need, right? So if you guys were in a specific business, let's say you're building snowmobiles, your raw materials would be to have all those parts. Okay, so your raw materials, going back to your ice cream, would be your bowls and your spoons and those kind of things. Those are your raw materials. We're going to use that to sell our product. Okay? Everybody good with that? These are the materials that are either going to be a part of your business or actually be your finished product. So if we were doing the snowmobile business, we would have a bunch of parts that at the end would make that final snowmobile. Okay? So those are raw materials, the things you're actually going to use to do whatever your company is doing. The next one's direct labor costs. So what's that mean?
Pay the people who make it.
To pay the people that are actually working on, so putting together that snowmobile, putting together that Sunday, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it happens to be, right? So this to me are your blue collar workers, your factory line people, the people that are, they're the people that are making the business run, right? The big wigs get all the glory and everything, but these are the people that if we didn't have these kind of people, we couldn't have a business, right? Okay, so we're going to pay the wages for those people that are on the actual product line, okay? And then we would go through and we would have certain divisions. So if we go back to the snowmobiles, Bunk's in charge of handlebars and everything that go along with the handlebars, okay? Ya's in charge of the body. Johnny's in charge of paint. Dylan's in charge of the skis, okay? So then they would each run their own division, and he would come up with a budget for how many people he has. And Ya would do, and Olivia would do, and Johnny would do, okay? So you'd each have your own, and you would break that down to how you're paying those people and what classifications they might be in. Have they been there a long time? Are they considered a manager? Those kind of things. But not necessarily the top dogs yet. Okay, so when we say managers, it would be more about like the leader of that little group. They wouldn't necessarily have that manager title yet, because that's a different way of paying them. Okay? So you're going to break it into certain things. And then factory overhead. What's overhead in a company?
CEO.
Nope.
Everything that doesn't correlate to the production of the actual product.
Exactly right. So the overhead is just what?
Like to keep the place running.
So what?
Utilities.
Utilities.
Yeah.
Electricity.
Yeah.
Rent. Right? All those kind of things. So the things to open the doors in sense, but to keep the thing running. Right? keeping maintenance up on your product or whatever. So not only that, besides this, now we're gonna pay our supervisors. Okay, so factory overhead includes the what I would call the bigger wigs. Okay, so in the last one, the last category, we're talking about direct labor costs for the actual workers, because those are the people that are doing all the work. And now in factory overhead, we're gonna pay our managers or supervisors. So the other ones in here that you see, we already said electricity, building rent. So do I own the building or not?
Yep.
Okay. Depreciation of equipment. So in our ice cream business, we probably don't have a whole lot of equipment.
Crusher, to crush ice cream too.
Okay, so we got a crusher. So that would have depreciation though, every time I use it or whatever, right?
We have a freezer.
Okay, freezer.
New one.
There you go. But in our other one, in our snowmobile, right? For Bunk to put her handlebars together, maybe she has a computer that actually does it, right? Johnny is in the paint side of it, so he would have some big old paint guns or whatever it happens to be, right? So all of that would be your depreciation. Remember, every time that I use it, basically it depreciates or it goes down in value. And we're going to figure out, how long we can utilize that crusher, right? For instance. Insurance, right? Don't forget about that. And then basic supplies. So I always think about, and this drives me crazy when I come here on the weekends, how many lights are left on in this building. Okay, so if you walk through here on some Saturday mornings, even on a Sunday, it's amazing how many lights you got to turn off. Okay, so that would drive me crazy. And if you're, especially the first year that you would do this, you probably really would be punching those kind of things or pinching those kind of things, because obviously that could, be a pretty drastic thing. Or if you, left the air conditioner on during the summertime, but then you left the doors wide open. It's probably not good for the business, right? Or vice versa in the wintertime. Okay, so you got to think about all that. So this is really important now when we talk about vocabulary. When they say prime cost, so in your problems, whether it's in your homework, on the test, on the quiz, when they say prime costs, we're talking about our raw materials plus our direct labor. Okay, raw materials and direct labor. And then the total manufacturing cost, we're going to include the factory overhead with that total. Make sense? Okay, so make sure that when you start doing that, you're going to go through and figure that out. We'll come back and do those in just a second, those examples. The last part of this is actually distributing your factory overhead. So remember when we were talking about the essential things that we need to open the company. We got to have utilities. We got to have water to have a restroom, right? We have to have electricity just to see or run your paint spray gun or whatever it happens to be. But in certain situations, Carson's in charge of all the office people, right? So what is his cost? Well, he has envelopes and pens and ink for the printer and those kind of things. Totally different expense than John's department, right? So John's department is probably, when he's doing paint, we're not using cheap stuff, right? Because we want our product to look good. So John's department probably goes through a lot more expenses than Carson's does, right? Buying a couple big pens or whatever is a lot different than trying to spray or have a certain kind of paint. Okay, so Carson would be upset if we divided the however many divisions that we had down the middle, right? Or equally, I mean. So if we had 5 subdivisions and our grand total of expenses was, we'll make it easy, $100,000, Carson would be upset if we took that $100,000 and divided by 5 and charged each division $20,000. You know what I'm saying? So we have to figure out not only in our factory overhead, but basically what we're going to do is figure it out by the amount of space that they do. So in their way of figuring it out, they're doing it by space. So the paint to the pens isn't probably the exact thing or comparison that they would make, but essentially they're saying Carson's division is only a little section of the warehouse, for instance. He's got the corner and he takes very little because we only have 2 people in the office besides him. John's department has to have a lot of space because they have to ventilate that and whatever, right? And he's got a lot of people in his department. So we're going to figure out the amount that each department is going to use by the amount of space that you're going to use. So the first thing that you have to do in these problems is figure out the total amount of space that you have, all right? So John would say, well, if we use this as our numbers right here, John's department was the biggest one. So he would say, well, my department uses 6,000 square feet. Carson's is the smallest, so his is the 2,200. And then Bunk would have one of those numbers and Yao would have the other number. So we'd add up all that space that they're doing and our grand total would have been 16,000 square feet. All right, so we're going to distribute the expenses by the amount of space that you're using. All right, and so once you figure out how much space you're going to do, you're going to then figure out from your total amount of space, how much does your department actually account for? So you're going to say what percentage of the total amount of space is the paint department. And so his was the 6,000. You would take whatever your department was and divide it by the total amount. So John's, in this case, if you see it right here, would have been a total of 0.375. Right? So once you find that amount, then you would go through and you would figure out, your accounting department would then say, okay, your total factory overhead expenses were, in this case, $28,000. So John, because of the amount of space that he used was 0.375 of the total, he would take that same decimal and multiply it by the number of expenses. And then he's going to pay $10,500, or his department is in charge of $10,500 of it, whereas Carson's was the smallest, so his $2,200 would have been, where 22 was
8,000.
right, 0.1375, so 33,850. And so you would divvy it up by basically the size of your department. Okay? So again, you probably don't think about those kind of things as you're, driving by certain buildings, but that happens every single day. You think about Wells, how many different departments and how many different, machines and those kind of things they got going on in a place like that. All right, so let's go back and look at a couple of these. So page 383 is the first one. Again, if you want to see any of this written down, yell out. Letter A, the records of a bicycle factory showed these costs for the goods produced in the first quarter of the year. Raw materials were $800,000, direct labor was $1.9 million, and factory overhead was $380,000. What was the prime cost of the goods produced during the quarter? So again, prime costs were what two things?
Materials
and direct labor. So we're going to take our $860,000 plus our $1.9 million, and our prime costs are what?
2.9 or something.
2.838 they say. Okay. So again, notice this. This is only the first quarter of the year. The first quarter of the year, they spent $2.9 million on costs. Right? So again, if you think back to where we were last chapter, now we would have to make that budget, right? Okay. So for instance, like right now, we actually had kind of this conversation after the basketball game the other day. Coach Ryan was talking about getting supplies for construction right now, and so was Lloyd Kraft, and he said that the amount of, or the cost of steel right now is out of this world. Okay, so he was going to do a bid on a job, and he signed it for $80,000. Well, the next day, the amount or the money for steel went up so much. If he would have done it one more day later, it would have cost him $110,000. So in one day, it went up $30,000. So that's where now people like Ryan and Loy in those kind of businesses are really scrambling, because how do you bid for things? You know, Ryan said it's nothing for construction right now. He's got a $20 million project coming up, but how do you bid that? You know, because of, he said one day to the next, it can go from $1,000 to $5,000 just like that.
Is that just because the transportation
Transportation,
of it?
or just the amount of things that are out there, right? They say like plywood's really in demand. There's certain things that are just absolutely in demand after the pandemic. Fertilizer is a big one, right? Okay, so you got to take in all those into consideration. And so, you know, again, you guys don't really think about that, but if you're eventually want to get into a business like that, that's kind of what you're going to have to think about. Okay, so then obviously the second part of that is just taking that first total that you had and adding your $387,000 on it. Okay. Letter B. So I think this one's a little different. To make 150 telephones, Comtech had these manufacturing costs: materials, labor, factory overhead. No, it's basically the same. Oh no, wait. Let's do the second part. Okay, so what was the prime cost of making the telephones? So again, the prime costs are those two things that we did in the first problem. But then the second part of it says, what was the total manufacturing cost of each phone, on average, to the nearest whole cent? So how do I do that part?
You divide it by 150.
Perfect. Okay, so whatever you got as your first answer, if you actually did it, is $3,257.55. I would take that number and divide it by what Bunk said, 150.
29.95.
29.95. Exactly right.
Just take the prime cost.
I have to go get it. Let me pull it. Okay. Otherwise, ask Coach Kurt.
Cost is just materials and labor.
All right, so everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
Otherwise, ask Coach Kurt for his keys and what's in that.
You take the prime cost,
No, the
total with the overhead?
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, you gotta go back and make sure that you take the grand total of it.
The overhead and the prime cost?
Yep, you gotta go back and do the grand total of all three of those numbers and then divide by 150. Everybody good?
Yeah.
Alright, turn the page. So basically we did letter C, but if you want to go through letter C again, we can kind of talk about it. So it says the four divisions of Panasol Electronics. So the first thing you got to do is find your total amount of space. So you take each of those numbers, 6,000, 2,800, 5,000, and 2,200. Add that all together, that's your total amount of space, and then you take each individual number and divide it by that total number. Okay, that's what we did right here in this part on the board. Okay? Carson, will you swing that to this problem? So this is this part right here. So my 16,000 is the grand total that we figured out of all of our space, and then each individual company's little subsection would take that and divide it by your 16,000 to get you a decimal. And then you take that decimal times whatever your total expenses were. In this case, it was 28,000. Okay?
Can we move it? Okay.
Excuse me. So, everybody okay with the numbers? Did you see how they got those numbers? So my answer would have been 10,500 and then 4,900 and so on. Okay. In letter D, Biosphere pays its managers a total of $500,000 a year. This expense is charged to 4 sections of the company on the basis of number of workers in each section. The number of workers are: fabrication has 120, testing has 20, painting has 46, and the assembly has 64. So what's the first thing that I have to do?
Add them all together.
Add them all together. So I'm gonna take, all the workers that we had and figure out that we have a grand total of what? 250 workers. Then I'm gonna take each subsection, so fabrication has 120, I'm gonna take 120 out of 250, and you should get a decimal. Or you can just use that fraction, but then I'm gonna take that times 500,000. So how much does fabrication get?
40,000.
Yeah, so their budget would have to include $240,000 to pay their section of the workers.
Sick.
So again, the most important thing is what Bunk said though at the beginning, is taking your grand total of the number of workers, finding your total, and then taking each subsection and dividing it out first to get that decimal. That's what a lot of people forget about. They just want to take the 120, for instance, and divide it by the 500,000. But that's not how it works. Okay? Makes a big difference. Questions here? So again, the other big part of this is remembering the vocabulary difference between prime cost and total cost of manufacturing. All right?
To move it back here.
So here are your problems.
Can you see my head?
Yes, I can see you there. All right, hit it.